Yeah, so thanks everybody for joining today. Hopefully it will be an interesting session, and I won't try to talk for the whole time because it would be great if we had a bit of time towards the end to discuss and hear some of your questions. So just to say, again, sort of apologies because this session was supposed to happen, I guess, last week it was, or the week before, and we needed to change it. So thank you very much for your flexibility if you had wanted to attend the first one, and hopefully it will be worth your time today as well. So let's dive right into the session. So I think basically everybody here will agree that, as our capacity to collect and leverage new data sources improves, we're increasingly able to do all sorts of fantastic things. So we can measure, map, and understand phenomena that were previously too resource intensive to track. We can link together data sources that were previously separate, giving us new sorts of insights at their intersection. We can make predictions based on past data. We can even do this sometimes in real time, which is really having a profound impact in a lot of areas. And we can also develop tools that assist in decision-making and with the hope of making these maybe less biased or more efficient. And so just a note on the terminology here. So I'm going to use the term novel data technologies to sort of encompass a whole bunch of different areas. So when we're thinking about the kind of rise of big data sources, as well as technologies like machine learning and artificial intelligence. So for the purposes of the presentation today, I'm using quite a broad concept there. So hopefully there's no confusion, and that helps us to cover a lot of ground. So I think also everybody on this call will be well aware that, as we sort of progress in sort of applying these novel data sources and technologies in new ways, we've also been seeing sort of a whole host of new potential harms and risks that we've been trying to kind of cope with. And so I've just taken kind of a very high level set of headlines, which I'm sure probably most people will have seen at some point, but basically things like somebody being wrongfully arrested on the basis of facial recognition technology, the idea that an algorithm is actually no better at predicting crimes than random people, the idea that big data is helping to automate inequality, as well as lots of concerns around, for example, the deployment of these new technologies and the impact on labor markets and jobs. So lots of new concerns being raised that we're having to sort of find new ways of coping with. So in the wake of a lot of these concerns, as well as, I guess, some of the more general issues that are coming out around kind of big tech companies and the way that they're operating, we've seen really a big rush to adopt and develop sort of ethical frameworks, practices, roles, various things like that. So again, I've just sort of put a very high level kind of overview of some of the main ones that we might expect to find. So on the left-hand side of the slide, there's a map that shows the geographic distribution of ethical AI guidelines that were released up until basically 2019. So large kind of concentration in the US and across Europe, but really sort of increasing quite quickly in terms of these guidelines being circulated. And then there's also new approaches such as algorithmic auditing and human oversight of algorithms. And I'll say a little bit more about the second one there in a minute. And then there's also been some really interesting work happening sort of within organizations themselves. And so I put one example here called Ethics Owners, which is building on some ethnographic and qualitative work that's been done by the researchers Emmanuel Moss and Jacob Metcalf, looking at the actual ethics practices inside technology companies in Silicon Valley and trying to really understand the ways that ethics are sort of being implemented and deployed in these organizations. So there's a lot of really interesting things happening in this broadly conceived sort of ethics space for these novel data technologies. But nonetheless, there are a number of critics who have argued that these are really not kind of good enough to help us deal with lots of these issues that are coming up. So I've just sort of pulled out a couple of the key themes that are coming from this critical literature. One of them is around the concern that lots of these initiatives are basically just a form of ethics washing. So you probably heard of greenwashing in a similar way to try to make things appear more environmentally sustainable than they are. And ethics washing in a similar vein is basically using the language of ethics to try to avoid regulation or public scrutiny or other forms of accountability. And so this has been a big point of contention. Others have pointed out that things like statements of principles tend to hide really deep sort of normative disagreements and often favor the preferences of powerful actors. Critics have also argued that some of these initiatives are actually ineffective for having meaningful change. And so in the work of Moss and Metcalf in particular, looking at the practices of Silicon Valley technology firms, they find that a lot of the kind of ethics practices are being kind of anchored into existing processes. So they're not the ones driving the activity that's being done. They're really having to sort of put it on top of things that are already happening, which means that there's very little opportunity for them to make kind of meaningful changes to some of the underlying things that these companies might be doing. And then it also risks distracting from bigger issues. And so there's been a big kind of debate, I guess, in the fair machine learning community, for example, around what the kind of correct definition of fairness is and how we quantify or put that into sort of a metric form. But people have argued that actually this really distracts us from, whether that technology, for example, should be developed in the first place, regardless of whether it meets this kind of abstract notion of fairness. So just to maybe dive into one of these examples, just to give you a little bit more kind of a deeper sort of view, which rather than a very high level one. There's a really interesting paper that came out by Ben Green, whose work I draw from again later in this presentation. But he basically argues that we've been really, really quick to sort of adopt this view of human oversight of algorithms as being an effective means of promoting the ethics of this work. But he argues for a number of reasons that this might actually not be a very good strategy in all cases. Not that it's never a good strategy, but that there might be some real limitations that we haven't really thought about. So the first is that the overseers who are tasked with this must sort of really understand the algorithm's operations or outputs, and actually some of the empirical evidence that's coming out with people actually testing some of this is finding that actually is maybe easier said than done. The oversight processes may also legitimize flawed and unaccountable algorithms. So there's a risk that it can sort of reduce scrutiny without actually reducing the harms. Just by having that process in place, people might think that our work is done. There's also a concern that oversight mechanisms can't actually address fundamental concerns around inaccurate or unfair or myopic algorithms. So basically, the decision to sort of improve or to stop using an algorithm might be actually very disconnected from these oversight processes. And finally, these oversight mechanisms might actually shift responsibility and accountability from the algorithm to the overseers. And there's some great work around something called the moral crumple zone, which is basically where individuals are actually blamed for things that are happening in the technology. So I would suggest going and having a look at that, or getting in touch with me afterwards, and I can share more information about that. So what's the point, I guess, of sharing this kind of back and forth of the situation that's currently going on here? I think there are a couple of important points.
Ma in teoria le spetterebbe davvero, se lei però partecipa.
I think someone's off mute. Okay, that's fine. So the first point is that how ethics, and I put it in quotes here because obviously that's part of the issue, is that the way that it's being defined, what it means in practice, and how it's deployed in something like AI remains really a contested domain. And as it's currently conceived, as a lot of these mechanisms, so statements of principles, auditing, oversight, the roles and the way that they're structured in tech companies, appear to be ill-suited to deal with the scale and complexity of the challenges that are created by these technologies. So it's not to say that they're not good, and that there are a lot of positives that are coming from this work that's being done, but just to say that they might not be enough. And so maybe what we should be thinking about is ethics as defined here as a starting point rather than an end point of our attempts to sort of harness these novel data technologies for the common good. So that brings us to, I guess, the key sort of argument that this presentation sort of hinges around, which is that these narrowly defined concepts of ethics must cede to a related form of social evaluation, which is politics. And we're using politics here in a very broad sense, so not necessarily partisan politics, but basically politics in the sense that anything that makes that affects or makes claims about the who, what, when, and how in social groups, both small and large. And so what does this actually mean? I think it can be helpful to think about some of the areas where these novel data technologies are being used. So for example, in whose CV to review, which children are flagged as being at risk in a database, or where police patrol. So even if we could perfectly satisfy some criterion of accuracy or transparency, these systems are still determining who gets what, when, and how. And the key point that a lot of the authors who are writing around this are making is that it's impossible to remain neutral on these points. So we have to make some kind of decision. Somebody's CV needs to be reviewed. We need some kids to potentially be flagged for being at risk. So there are a lot of decisions that need to be made that have a more political nature than a purely sort of technological one. And so again, just to sort of try to bring some of this to life a little bit more in case it's a bit too abstract. One great example of this comes from the researcher Doris Allhutter and her colleagues. And they looked at a Jobseeker algorithm that's been used in Austria. And so this has been an algorithm developed to improve the efficiency of counseling processes and the effectiveness of government labor market programs. They essentially use a model of job seekers' prospects on the labor market to determine the support received. So they put people into 3 different groups, depending on how likely they are to find work within a certain period of time. And so Allhutter and her colleagues went through and sort of looked critically at the technical and the policy documentation to see how the algorithm and its development were actually influenced by social values, norms, and goals. And what they found was that the algorithm itself is really deeply influenced by the way that unemployment is framed in Austria's shift from a welfare to a workfare state. So essentially the way that it frames benefits recipients as a burden to society and being morally obliged to work. And it also sort of moves from this more holistic understanding of job seeker characteristics, which would typically include things like soft skills and motivation, towards a numerical representation of features leading to a metric of employability. So it's a really great paper. I would highly recommend going to read it afterwards. And I have a full list of references at the end, so you don't need to look that up on your own. So I would be remiss to say that these arguments around the sort of politics of algorithms or the politics of data science more generally are sort of new arguments. And actually, they're building on a long history of similar arguments coming from areas like science and technology studies. And so one of the most, I guess, kind of seminal papers in this vein is Langdon Winner's 1980 paper, Do Artifacts Have Politics, where he points to more the sort of built environment and several examples there. But one of the most famous is the bridges in New York being built in such a way that they prevent buses from lower income neighborhoods from reaching the beaches of the wealthier areas in the city. So this is kind of in the same vein, and scholars now are building on some of this work and asking, are data scientists the new architects of the modern world? And if so, how do we understand the work that they're doing in a similar vein? And so what I wanted to do now was sort of shift a little bit to 2 really, really interesting kind of pieces of work that have come out in the last couple of years that really try to take this idea of the kind of politics of algorithms very seriously and try to kind of put forward prescriptions on what that would mean in practice. And so these 2 pieces of work are the book Data Feminism by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein, and Data Science as Political Action by Ben Green. And so this is actually also a good time to say that this work and a lot of the source material that I'm drawing from is based in the US or in sort of Western Europe. And so it would be really interesting to understand from the perspective of people on the call, who are not coming from those geographies, whether these points resonate with you, whether, you think it's a completely sort of different context where you're living and working. So I'll go through this, and then we can hopefully have some time to discuss afterwards. So just very briefly, data feminism is a way of thinking about data, both their uses and their limits, that's informed by direct experience, a commitment to action, and intersectional feminist thought. Very importantly, data feminism is not only about or for women, and it focuses on a number of core principles around power, around emotion, around binaries, pluralism, context, and labor. So anyone who's familiar with sort of feminist scholarship more generally will recognize some of these themes. Data science as political action, by contrast, is Ben Green sort of putting forward a number of arguments that data scientists must consider themselves as political actors engaged in normative constructions of society. And this is a really interesting paper because he basically pulls out a number of the kind of arguments that data scientists put forward as to why this is not the case. So they'll say things like, I'm just an engineer, it's not our job to take political stances, and we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And so he goes through and tries to sort of disassemble some of these arguments. So each of these provides a really interesting set of prescriptions and arguments that I think are really valuable in their own right. So if you're interested, I would highly recommend going and having a look at both of them. But the reason I wanted to focus in on them today was because they have some key sort of similarities that help us to build sort of a unified account that we can look at. So they both focus on the role of data scientists as key actors. Obviously, there are lots of other ways that we could consider this question of the politics of algorithms and who, which kind of area we focus on, but for this, we'll focus on the role of data scientists. And they also both really emphasize some of the shortcomings of ethics, as I described towards the start, and argue for a reorientation around justice as a guiding value for developing these novel data technologies. And the reason that I actually came upon this work in the first place was because it was building from work we had been doing around sort of data justice at Nesta. So again, this term data justice is encompassing a whole bunch of different areas, lots of different sort of movements, lots of different activities. So this is just one very short or very small kind of subsection that we'll be focusing on today. So I just wanted to sort of give three kind of headline themes that kind of cut across, and the way that these authors are thinking about the role of data scientists within this kind of beyond ethics paradigm. And so the first sort of overarching question is around what data scientists are actually accountable for producing. And so there are three sort of sub-themes that come out. So the first is, does the intervention challenge or reinforce an unjust status quo? The second is whether the intervention accounts for the full complexity of the issue at hand, or whether it's sort of really narrowing something a little bit too much, and whether the right types of contributions are being rewarded. And so unfortunately, I don't have time to go into each of these questions in detail, but I'll just choose one of them to give you a bit of an example, just to kind of bring it to light. So this is an example drawn from the work of Ruha Benjamin, whose 2019 book, Race After Technology, I can really highly recommend if you're interested in this area. And Benjamin talks about the abolitionist movement in the US. And so basically this is sort of the social justice movement that's seeking to divest resources from policing and prisons and to redirect them into other areas like mental health, education, employment, and so on. And this is increasingly moving into sort of the digital arena, in the sense that there are lots of kind of ways that machine learning algorithms, decision assistance tools, and things like that are increasingly being used within this debate. So it's an area, particularly in the US scholarship, that's receiving a lot of attention. And the reason that it is receiving a lot of attention is because areas like pretrial detention and bail payments are sites of huge injustice. So basically, one statistic in the book is that around 700,000 people are condemned to local jails and separated from their families, and most of them stay there because they can't afford to pay their bail. So this obviously has very different impacts on different people in society. And the reason here that I wanted to bring this up is not specifically because of the abolition dimension, which I'm not an expert in, but just to compare and contrast the two different ways that novel data technologies are being used within this space to demonstrate the difference between them. So Benjamin talks about one app, which is called Abolition, which was developed in collaboration with the National Bailout Movement. And they say that this technology is developed with an emancipatory ethos, and they raised around $230,000 to direct to local organizations who can post bail for people who can't afford to pay. And then the idea is that the money would be recycled and it could be kind of taken up by people later on. So it's a more sustainable business model. The second app that Benjamin profiles is called Promise, which billed itself as a decarceration startup. And essentially the way that this app would work is that they would charge the counties $17 per day, which is actually a cost saving for them because they would normally have to pay about $200 a day to keep someone in jail. This one raised around 3 million in venture capital, including from Jay-Z. So the authors argued that this gave it some sort of celebrity status. And it creates a powerful mechanism for putting people back in jail for technical violations. So the key point here is that it does reduce pretrial detention, but actually it's been criticized for expanding the scope of the prison industrial complex rather than fundamentally challenging it. So moving on to the next set of themes. So these authors also ask the question of to whom data scientists are accountable. And there are two sort of sub-themes that come up here, which is how can data scientists become more directly accountable to the people who will be affected by the work that they do, and in particular minoritized groups, so people who have been unjustly oppressed, depending on the context that you're in, that those people might differ, but that's why we use that term minoritized rather than minority. And what mechanisms exist for people to do data science with rather than for people. And so drawing here from the work of data feminism, they kind of operate within this idea of coliberation, which is the idea that oppressive structures harm everybody, not just those who have been historically oppressed. And so they offer a number of really concrete kind of recommendations actually for what data science would look like if it was done sort of in this vein. This includes things like having leadership by minoritized groups working in the community, having money and resources managed by them, having data owned and governed by the community, having quantitative data analysis, ground truth through participatory community-based analysis processes. Interestingly, they have a whole section on sort of redefining what a data scientist actually is. And so this sense that data scientists are usually considered to be sort of rock stars or wizards, actually arguing that they need to transfer into a role of being a facilitator. And this is linked into the way that the projects are structured. So having data education and knowledge transfer as part of the project, and also building community infrastructure as part of the work that's being done. So we can see already sort of how different this approach to data science might be from kind of a traditional way that we might imagine a data science project happening in, even in a university or in an organization. And then the third and final sort of set of themes is around what data scientists kind of what skills and capacities they need and who they actually are. So of course, in line with a lot of the current concerns around sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's a big question around how we ensure that data scientists represent a diverse subset of society. There's also questions around how data scientists can adopt a more critical perspective and distance themselves from the notion that their work is neutral or value-free. As we saw from Ben Green's arguments, this is still a very common sort of view. And there's also a question about how data scientists can develop a deeper understanding of social and political issues that can inform their work. And so again, just one very quick example here of ways of work that's kind of going on in this space. Abiba Birhain and colleagues have gone through about 100 highly cited machine learning papers and pulled out what values are actually being put forward, I guess, as part of this work. And so they found that performance values, things like the generalizability, the efficiency, the novelty of the work being done were really highly sort of kind of put forward in these papers as being important. Whereas on the right-hand side, we can see that things like justice, respect for persons, autonomy, and safety even, for example, were much less likely to sort of figure into the papers. And so this is interesting because it's kind of starting to show us more clearly actually the way that these values are existing in the work that's being done, but might not always be sort of front of mind. We might just sort of write about them without really thinking about why that particular value is or isn't included or important. So I'm just going to check my time here. Oh yeah, we're good on time. So this is the second part of the presentation, and I'll just keep rolling through. Unless, Tiff, is there any reason to break?
Not at all. No, okay. You can keep going.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So this, I guess, is more sort of a work in progress, because as we've been in the last few years trying to sort of think about some of these ways of working and what they would look like in practice, we've been trying to explore how these are positive and also what challenges they might run into. So how actionable are these? And so there are two sort of challenges that I want to point to here. The first is that obviously both of these accounts that I presented assume the primacy of justice. And in doing so, they don't really prepare data scientists for kind of environments or projects where justice isn't a central or even peripheral concern to the people that they're working with. So it's presented very much in a way that everyone will kind of agree that justice is a viable or worthy goal of the work of developing novel data technologies. The second challenge is that these accounts, I think, overestimate the degree of influence or control the data scientists can have when they're embedded in organizations that have sort of certain ways of functioning, certain goals that they're trying to achieve. And so in order to make some of these prescriptions more actionable, we need better ways of understanding and working within these two challenges. So I'll just kind of briefly go through a couple of different ways that we've started to think about this. So on this first challenge around the primacy of justice, we can think about this as a question of values. And so the literature on values is really interesting, but again, one that doesn't get a lot of attention specifically in the world of data science. So to value something is to be disposed to act for the sake of that thing. And the reason this is important is because value conflicts will pull us in different directions and lead to sort of incoherence in a team, in an organization. And so often, debates that we have around kind of methodological issues can be traced back to value differences. And there's a whole sort of body of research in the philosophy of science, for example, that looks at these questions. And so, as I mentioned, the accounts that I just presented from D'Ignazio, Klein, and Green really point to justice as being the kind of primary value that we should be working towards. But this suggests that data scientists need to be able to speak the language of values and manage value conflicts that will inevitably arise in practice. And they might not be kind of equipped to do that. And so one approach that we've been experimenting with is this framework from the 2020 book, Science and Moral Imagination, A New Ideal for Values in Science. So it's a philosophy of science book, but it's very practical, very, very interesting, and I would highly recommend. It's also available in open source, so you don't need to buy it, or in open access, sorry. And essentially Brown's framework is quite simple. It has 4 different dimensions to it. It has the values, the goal or the task that we're trying to achieve, the options or alternatives that this creates, and then the stakeholders who might be affected. And the idea is that this framework is an iterative tool that you can use to sort of think through what values are actually influencing the data science work that you're doing, and then what sort of trade-offs you might want to make in practice. So I'll go through an example. It's a little bit messy, so please bear with me, but hopefully it helps to illustrate what this could look like in practice. So this is from an example that's actually used in data feminism. And the authors talk about this task of wanting to access data for a study on housing evictions in low-income neighborhoods. And so this is the initial goal that they start with. And so one option that they have available to them is to use an open access, nationally representative data set on evictions. And so this is interesting because it has sort of a national level view of who's been evicted, although it's not very good in terms of what the reasons are for the evictions. So the values that this data set actually sort of embodies is that it's efficient, it's available for download, easy to sort of do quite quickly and get your hands on. It's scalable. So again, by being sort of a national level data set, there are lots of different kind of levels that you could potentially look at. And it's open access. And so these are all things that are generally, pretty positive values that we could see. But if we introduce this question of justice in the way that it's described earlier around sort of coliberation, equity, and anti-oppression, we might actually shift our focus a little bit and think about, we might want a more sort of granular local level understanding of residents in a particular area who have been evicted. Considering the more local level, actually, we start to realize that the local landlords are a group of stakeholders that we hadn't really considered. How might they react to this type of analysis being done? What sort of retaliatory sort of measures could they take? So even just thinking about it through this lens, we kind of get a different stakeholder landscape. But it also opens up new possibilities. So we actually find that, for example, there might be a data set that's been collected and curated by a local anti-eviction coalition. And in finding that, we see that actually there are big differences between this open access nationally representative data set and the more local curated data set. And so we would be underreporting essentially the evictions happening in a local area if we were to focus on the nationally representative data set. And the reason for this is because this open access nationally representative data set is actually intended primarily for academic researchers and not for, say, advocacy or kind of policy purposes. So it's standardized, which again can be a potentially good thing, but it might come into tension or into conflict with this way of conceptualizing justice as it's been presented in the data feminism work. And so it's not to say that one option is necessarily, much better than the other, but it's just to say that this gives us a much kind of deeper understanding of the way that our methodological choices are interacting with our values. And it's also worth pointing out just very quickly here that, this is the moral imagination framework, but there are lots of other sort of values-based approaches that can be used. So value-sensitive design, socio-technical integration research. There are a number of different kind of methods that have been used to integrate values into research and into data science work. So this is just one example that you could potentially use. But one of the things that, again, data scientists are not typically sort of trained in, I would suggest, is the ability to sort of manage these conflicts. So we can have the sort of framework which shows us the ways that the values actually influence our methodological decisions. But actually, it can be very difficult if you're in a team and one person says, I think that the focusing on justice is really important, and someone else says, no, I think focusing on standardization and efficiency are the most important. Then you end up in sort of a value conflict. And there's really interesting research being done in areas like collaborative environmental science, where we're having lots of different sort of groups coming together with different methodological perspectives. And this is kind of creating new tools for ways of dealing with value conflicts in teams. And so this is just one example from a 2021 paper on how to resolve problematic value conflicts within research teams. And so you may need to actually dissolve the team if the conflicts are too strong. But there are other ways that you could potentially come to a compromise. You could create a new set of values that everybody in the team adheres to. And then you can develop ways to sort of adopt and work within those values in the project team. So again, this is something that often I think doesn't really get a lot of attention in data science projects, but some of the work that we've been doing around mixed methods research as well has shown just how important this question of values really is. And so this is the last sort of main section of the presentation, and then hopefully we'll have time for some discussion. But this is just around the kind of institutional context that I mentioned before. And so one of the challenges with making the prescriptions that authors like D'Ignazio, Klein, and Green put forward, one of the reasons it's challenging is because they don't really pay a lot of attention to the actual kind of context that data scientists will be working in. And so there's a lot of really interesting research in the area of sort of institutional theory that's looking at something called institutional logics, which is basically practices and principles that are rooted in historical assumptions, values, and beliefs that provide the framework within which actors can understand what they can or should do. And so the first sort of hypothesis here is that this will affect not just the boundaries of the technical decisions that data scientists can make, but also how they're incentivized, how their teams and workflows are structured, and the results for which they're held accountable. And the second hypothesis here, which is, again, this is all sort of a work in progress, is that particularly in countries like the UK and the US, data scientists will be influenced by the institutional logics of market supremacy, technological solutionism, meritocracy, scale thinking, and a drive for efficiency. And we sort of explore a couple of different mechanisms why that may be the case. And I'll just quickly give an example for the second mechanism, which is this idea that practices actually originating in Silicon Valley will influence the work of data scientists elsewhere through the process of institutional isomorphism, which is essentially this idea that organizations in the same field converge on similar structures over time. So this really interesting paper from Kaplan and Boyd basically showed the effect of Facebook's newsfeed algorithm. So as anybody who's been following kind of discussions in news or journalism or media and how that area has been evolving, we've seen a huge shift from sort of print-based to digital forms of media. And this has had really big implications for, say, the availability of local news. But what we've seen is that there's this sort of evidence of what the authors call this coercive isomorphism of Facebook's newsfeed algorithm, which basically has reoriented the economics of journalism around metrics like likes and shares. So publishers who had early success in the newsfeed were the ones who subsumed their own organizational practices to the logic of Facebook's algorithms. And so this means that the work of data scientists in these organizations is not going to be sort of removed entirely from what's going on in Facebook, essentially, and that all of these organizations are trying to compete and eventually become more homogenous as they conform to these dominant practices and ways that the field is evolving. So this is one kind of interesting mechanism that I think is deserving of a lot more attention. And then at the sort of institutional logic level, I've just pulled out one of the examples that I gave here, but basically this idea of a dominant institutional logic that we would find in a lot of sectors, in government, in private sector, even in nonprofits, is a drive for efficiency. So we know that this is, long been associated with progress and modernity, and that we're kind of always preoccupied with how we can accelerate and do more with less. And we see this, I guess, through the use of tools like cost-benefit analysis or value for money. And some of the prescriptions that are put forward in the sort of ideal account would run sort of directly counter to this and run into a lot of potential issues. And so, for example, tools like data sheets for data sets, which if you just Google that, it's a really interesting one that helps you to explore more systematically the kind of context or origin of a data source before you use it. That's going to create friction. That's going to add more time into your process rather than just kind of diving directly into using a data source that you kind of downloaded off the internet. Structural reforms. So think back to the very first sort of set of themes that I talked about with the abolition example. So these more structural reforms are probably not going to be the most cost effective of all the options that might be available to us. So it's going to make it hard to sort of choose those more kind of structural or more ambitious interventions. Also, engaging in sort of co-creative or participatory processes can take a lot more time and resources and have less certain sort of impacts or outputs than, say, expert-only approaches. And then finally, developing skills like critical thinking or humility in order to critically question and assess the work that data scientists themselves are carrying out might actually not be very welcome in some scenarios where they're incentivized to just sort of produce outputs, and this idea of slowing down and questioning the process actually could be seen as potentially a distraction from the quote unquote real work. So this is just to say that there are a number of potential challenges that these approaches risk running into. And so this is just the final slide, which is to end, hopefully not on a on too negative of a note, but it's to say that there might be opportunities here for sort of institutional innovation if we think about things like institutional pluralism and hybridity. And there's a whole body of research around how sort of multiple institutional logics can be managed at once and different approaches that can be taken to sort of minimize conflict between them. And so if we are to take sort of the work of Green, Ignazio, and Klein and say, you know, does this form itself kind of a new sort of institutional logic that needs to kind of exist within organizations that maybe don't currently embody those logics, then what are the opportunities that we can have to sort of identify the conflicts that are arising and manage them in a productive way so that we can move forward on some of these points. So as I mentioned, this is all very much a work in progress. So very interested to hear your feedback and questions. So very briefly, just to summarize, I started out by essentially saying that critics have argued that the current approaches that we're taking to ethics may fail to fundamentally address the political nature of these novel data technologies, and that we've seen a number of proposals coming forward to help data scientists in particular grapple with the political nature of their work, arguing for reconsideration of what they're accountable for delivering, to whom they're accountable, and who they actually are and what skills and capacities they need. But in order to be actionable, these need to be supplemented by a clear understanding of values and the way that they might conflict and how we can manage these value conflicts in practice, as well as a deeper appreciation of institutional logics that shape the work that data scientists are doing in the organizations that they work within. So there are, some references there, and I just opened Zeterio. Apologies for that. Let me stop sharing now. And yeah, I think that's it. So thank you so much, and right on time.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chantale. So thank you for stopping sharing your screen. What I'm going to do now is that I'm going to stop recording the session so that maybe we can open the Q&A session. And yes, I'm going to do this now.